Number 1.
Karen was last seen in Torrance, California on August 18, 1961. She and her younger 8-year-old brother were attending a summer arts and crafts class at Halldale Avenue Elementary School at 215th Street and Halldale Avenue in Harbor Gateway. On this particular day, however, their pet dog followed them to the school. Karen's brother took the dog back home before the class ended, but Karen decided to stay behind. According to the teachers and fellow students, Karen left the class when it ended at 5:30 p.m. during that day. She was carrying 2 toy-covered wagons, which were the crafts that she and her brother made in class that day. Karen rode with a friend on a bicycle for the first few minutes of the walk. The walk between the school and Karen's home is only 4 blocks. She never arrived home and was never seen or heard from again. Karen was reported missing at 6 p.m. when her parents noticed she never came back home. Authorities suspect she was abducted by a non-family member as she walked home. Volunteers, which included neighbors and relatives, searched for her throughout the area. Police and patrol were on motor and in helicopters. Despite various searches, she was never found. On August 23, a man was arrested in connection to her presumed abduction. The man was later identified as Lonnie Smith from Long Beach, California. He was 40 years old at the time of his arrest. He was initially arrested for intoxication, but he apparently mumbled Karen's name and was rebooked on suspicion of kidnapping her. Police also found bloodstains on his underclothes. However, investigators had no clear evidence that Lonnie was involved in Karen's abduction, and he was eventually cleared because his alibi for that time was checked and confirmed. He was in Paramount purchasing an automobile at the exact time the child disappeared. Police also arrested an ex-convict, Clarence E. McDonald, on suspicion of taking Karen after police found girls' panties in his vehicle. He was initially arrested for robbery. He was eventually cleared in the investigation. Karen was the first Southern Californian girl to disappear within a 2-week period. On September 2, 1961, Ramona Irene Price was abducted as she walked to her new house in Santa Barbara. Investigators believe that both Karen's and Ramona's abductions are connected. Investigators also believe the 1962 abduction and murder of Dorothy Gale Brown is connected to the cases. Brown was kidnapped on July 2, 1962, after she left her residence on her bike to go to a local car wash in Torrance, California to purchase sodas. Dorothy's bike was later found abandoned by her father at 8:30 p.m. The next day, articles of Dorothy's clothing were found in beer cans. At noon, 2 skin divers discovered Dorothy's body floating in a kelp bed about 150 yards offshore. It was estimated that her body was in the water for 6 to 8 hours before she was found. Her murder remains unsolved. Investigators have noted similarities in the Tompkins case and Brown case. Both girls were 11 years old and had blonde hair. They both disappeared at roughly the same time during the day and from only blocks apart. Investigators believe Karen is likely deceased due to passage of time, and since the circumstances of her disappearance suggest she was kidnapped. Investigators believe Karen was a victim of serial killer, McRae Edwards. They also believe Ramona Price and Dorothy Brown were other victims of him. Edwards is believed to be responsible for up to 20 murders and disappearances of children throughout a 16-year time period. He was an active killer from 1953 up until 1969. Edwards wasn't arrested until 1970 when he and a teenage accomplice kidnapped 3 girls from their home in Selmer. The girls managed to escape and were rescued. Edwards was fearful that the girls would identify him as their kidnapper. Edwards surrendered to police in 1970 and confessed to the molestation and murder of 6 children. Edwards was charged with 3 of these killings. Edwards confessed that he abducted, raped, and murdered 8-year-old Stella Darlene Nolan on June 20, 1953 in Compton, California. She was missing for 17 years until he led authorities to her remains. A highway crew found her skeletal remains in March of 1970 after being led there by Edwards' direction. She was his first victim. Edwards also confessed to killing 16-year-old Gary Roche, who was found shot to death on November 26, 1968, in Granada Hills, California. He also confessed to killing Donald Allen Todd, who was 13 when he disappeared from Pacoima, California on May 16, 1969. He was later found shot to death after being sexually assaulted. Edwards additionally confessed to the 1956 murders of Brenda Jo Howell and Donald Lee Baker. They both disappeared from Azusa, California on August 6, 1956, and were never found. Brenda was Edwards' sister-in-law at the time. He also confessed to killing 15-year-old Roger Dale Madison, who disappeared on December 16, 1968. His body was never found. Edwards was not charged with killing Howell, Baker, or Madison, since their bodies remain missing, but investigators are certain he was responsible for what happened to them. Investigators suspect due to the gap between his crimes, he likely had many more victims. Edwards' victims usually ranged from 7 to 16 years of age. Investigators believe Edwards was also responsible for the 1957 disappearance of Thomas Eldon Bowman and the 1960 disappearance of Bruce Howard Creeman. Neither boy has been found, but Edwards once wrote a letter to his wife, saying he left out his confession to Thomas Bowman's murder to police. Investigators have attempted to uncover the remains of Edwards' other victims in recent years, but nothing has ever been found. Edwards hung himself in prison on October 30, 1971. There's no actual evidence to indicate that Edwards was involved in Karen's abduction, but investigators are certain he was involved in her disappearance and presumed death. At the time of her disappearance, Karen lived with her younger brother and infant sister, as well as her mother and grandmother. Karen's father was stationed with the United States Navy at sea in 1961, but he came home after finding out his daughter was snatched. He never gave up searching for her. Karen's father is deceased and her mother passed away in 2008. Her siblings now live in Florida. Karen was said to be a great student in 1961. Foul play is suspected in her disappearance, which remains unsolved.
Number 2.
David was last seen in Issaquah, Washington on May 3, 1968. After he attended school that day, he took the bus back to his family's residence, which was located on in the 14,000 block of 240 Avenue, Southeast Tiger Mountain Road. Afterwards, he left to go to a friend's home in the neighborhood to play. He was told to be home by 5 p.m. David called his mother from his friend's home and asked if he could stay longer, but she said he couldn't. She told him to come home. David left his friend's home and started walking on a local trail which he used as a shortcut to get back home. David never arrived back home and was never seen again. When David hadn't returned within 15 minutes, his mother called the friend's home to find out why he wasn't at home yet. She realized he was no longer at the home, and she called the police to report him missing. Over 1,000 people with the help of dogs searched for David, but despite the extensive searches, no trace of David was ever found. Investigators initially believed that David got into some type of a catastrophe and considered the possibility that he fell down an old coal mine or was attacked by a wild animal, possibly a cougar or beat, and dragged off. Investigators no longer believe this is what caused his disappearance and now suspect David was abducted. In 2009, investigators reopened the investigation into David's disappearance and identified a person of interest in the case. The person was identified as a former neighbor of David and his family. The man was said to be a Vietnam veteran, and he claimed he helped search for the boy when he first disappeared in 1968. The man was approximately 20 years of age in 1968. Authorities believe the man was probably the last person who saw David alive on the day of his disappearance. Tracker dogs who searched for David traced his scent to the man's residence. The man does not have a convincing alibi, and he has failed many polygraph exams in relation to the case. He also felt nervous and stressed in the interrogation. The man now lives in Lewis County, Washington, and is in his 70s. He continues to maintain his innocence in the case. In 2011, during a police interrogation, he failed another polygraph exam given to him by police, and his cell phone was taken to be examined. It's unknown if anything was found during the search. Investigators believe David's case is solvable and hope to recover him. His parents were still alive when the case was reopened in 2009, and his sister, who was born after his disappearance, has publicly commented on the case. She does not believe he's alive and hopes to possibly recover his remains. David was a third-grade student at Clark Elementary School in 1968 and was described as a good student. He was one of 6 siblings and was the second oldest child in his family. David's case remains unsolved and foul play is suspected.
Number 3.
Ramona was last seen in Santa Barbara, California on September 2, 1961. She was last seen leaving her residence located on Oak Avenue at approximately 11 a.m. Ramona and her family were in the process of moving houses at the time of her disappearance. Ramona told her father that she was going to walk to their new house, which was 7 miles away at the time in Walnut Park. He merely thought she was joking and didn't believe she would actually do it. Ramona was discovered missing approximately a half an hour later by her parents. Ramona was reported missing that night by her father. She was never seen or heard from again. An extensive search was commenced on the route that police believe Ramona took in order to get to the new house. The route was covered by men on foot, horseback, and helicopter. Over 200 volunteers participated in the search for Ramona. Bloodhounds were also utilized in the search for Ramona, and they traced her scent for approximately 2 miles down Modoc Road near the 101 freeway, which was under construction at the time of her disappearance. Investigators believe Ramona was abducted by a stranger where the scent ended. A witness in the case recalled seeing Ramona speaking with an unidentified man inside of a vehicle. The vehicle was described as a faded blue-colored 1953 to 1954 vintage Plymouth. The man driving the vehicle was described as being between 30 and 40 years of age in 1961. He was said to be Caucasian with dark-colored eyes and hair. He had a receding hairline and thin features. The man was noted to be wearing an open-collared sports shirt over a white undershirt. Ramona was seen getting into his vehicle which drove away. Ramona's alleged abductor has not been identified. Two brothers who were known sex offenders were initially suspected of involvement in Ramona's abduction. They both admitted they had seen Ramona walk by their home and even spoke to her briefly. The two men denied harming or touching Ramona on the day of her abduction. Both men were eventually cleared of suspicion after they both passed lie detector tests in regards to the case. Ramona was the second Southern Californian girl to disappear within a 2-week period. On August 18, 1961, Karen Lynn Tompkins was abducted as she walked home from art class. Investigators believe that both Ramona and Karen's abductions are connected. Investigators also believe the 1962 abduction and murder of Dorothy Gale Brown is connected to the cases. Brown was kidnapped on July 2, 1962, after she left her residence on her bike to go to a local car wash in Torrance, California to purchase sodas. Dorothy's bike was later found abandoned by her father at 8:30 p.m. The next day, articles of Dorothy's clothing were found in beer cans. At noon, two skin divers discovered Dorothy's body floating in a kelp bed about 150 yards offshore. It was estimated that her body was in the water for 6 to 8 hours before she was found. Her murder remains unsolved. Investigators have noted similarities in the Tompkins case and Brown case. Both girls were 11 years old and had blonde hair. They both disappeared at roughly the same time during the day and from only blocks apart. Investigators believe Ramona is likely deceased due to passage of time, and since the circumstances of her disappearance are suspicious. Investigators believe Ramona was a victim of serial killer, McRae Edwards. They also believe Karen Tompkins and Dorothy Brown were other victims of him. Edwards is believed to be responsible for up to 20 murders and disappearances of children throughout a 16-year time period. He was an active killer from 1953 up until 1969. Edwards wasn't arrested until 1970 when he and a teenage accomplice kidnapped 3 girls from their home in Selmer. The girls managed to escape and were rescued. Edwards was fearful that the girls would identify him as their kidnapper. Edwards surrendered to police in 1970 and confessed to the molestation and murder of 6 children. Edwards was charged with 3 of these killings. Edwards confessed that he abducted, raped, and murdered 8-year-old Stella Darlene Nolan on June 20, 1953 in Compton, California. She was missing for 17 years until he led authorities to her remains. A highway crew found her skeletal remains in March of 1970 after being led there by Edwards' direction. She was his first victim. Edwards also confessed to killing 16-year-old Gary Roche, who was found shot to death on November 26, 1968, in Granada Hills, California. He also confessed to killing Donald Allen Todd, who was 13 when he disappeared from Pacoima, California on May 16, 1969. He was later found shot to death after being sexually assaulted. Edwards additionally confessed to the 1956 murders of Brenda Jo Howell and Donald Lee Baker. They both disappeared from Azusa, California on August 6, 1956, and were never found. Brenda was Edwards' sister-in-law at the time. He also confessed to killing 15-year-old Roger De La Madison, who disappeared on December 16, 1968. His body was never found. Edwards was not charged with killing Howell, Baker, or Madison, since their bodies remain missing, but investigators are certain he was responsible for what happened to them. Investigators suspect due to the gap between his crimes, he likely had many more victims. Edwards' victims usually ranged from 7 to 16 years of age. Investigators believe Edwards was also responsible for the 1957 disappearance of Thomas Eldon Bowman and the 1960 disappearance of Bruce Howard Creeman. Neither boy has been found, but Edwards once wrote a letter to his wife, saying he left out his confession to Thomas Bowman's murder to police. Edwards wasn't officially named a suspect in Ramona's case until 2011, 50 years after her abduction. Investigators have stated he matches the description of Ramona's supposed abductor, and he also owned a vintage Plymouth vehicle. Edwards was working at the Freeway 101 construction site when Ramona disappeared, and investigators believe he buried her body in the area. Investigators searched the area of Freeway 101 for her remains, but nothing was found, and it has since been demolished. Despite this, investigators are convinced Edwards probably killed Ramona. Investigators have attempted to uncover the remains of Edwards' other victims in recent years, but nothing has ever been found. Edwards hung himself in prison on October 30, 1971. Ramona was a second-grade student at the time she went missing. Her parents and grandparents are both deceased, but her older sister is still alive and hopes to find out what happened to her sister. Ramona's body has never been found, but foul play is suspected in the case.
Number 4.
Ricky was last seen in Moston, Wisconsin on December 19, 1949. She was at her family's farm residence located 3 miles northeast of the town. Her parents, Raymond Bryant and Opal Bryant, were not at the home when she disappeared. Ricky, her older brother, Forrest, and her younger sister, Elizabeth, were being watched by their grandmother, Helen Halverston. Ricky's older sister, Sharon, was at a nearby schoolhouse. A fire broke out at the Bryant family home, but accounts differ as to how exactly Ricky disappeared. Helen stated that she escorted both Forrest and Elizabeth out of the home and ran back inside to search for Ricky because she assumed she was still inside. She stated she begged for an answer from the child but got nothing and reportedly couldn't understand how she could still be in the house. After Helen couldn't locate Ricky, she grabbed a ladder and propped it against the house. She climbed up to the second-story level of the house so she could rescue her husband, Casper, who was handicapped at the time. She said she carried him down the ladder to safety. A firefighter who was attempting to put out the flames said he heard the screaming of a child come from the house, but that he couldn't find her. Investigators and her family initially believed Ricky perished in the fire. Some accounts state Ricky may have fallen through the staircase in the home, but it's unknown if this happened. A day after the fire, a search uncovered particles that looked like bone fragments. The particles were taken to the state crime laboratory in Madison, but tests came back negative. Despite her claims, Halverston's alleged search for Ricky in the fire has been contradicted by both newspapers from that time, as a shocking statement from Forrest. Forrest claimed that he, Elizabeth, and Ricky all made it out of the home and were told to wait in the yard and watch his sisters by Halverston. Forrest said a tall woman with blonde hair pulled up to the residence in a newer model car. The woman urged Forrest to get help from a neighbor, but instead of sending him to a nearby house, she sent him to a residence that was farther away from the house. She told him the phone at the nearest house wasn't working. Forrest went and got the neighbor who came to help. When they returned, the woman and Ricky were gone. The car that was driven was also gone. The neighbor stated she went inside the residence to help Halverston look for the child. While she was searching, Halverston said, "Don't worry about the girl, she's with a relative." After the fire, Ricky's name was never mentioned in the family again. They only said her name whenever they put the star on the Christmas tree. They would say she was a star in heaven. Investigators and Ricky's remaining family do not believe she perished in the fire. Her siblings believed the fire was set as a diversion in order to take Ricky. It's believed the strange woman probably abducted Ricky and took her away from the area. It's possible Ricky was conceived out of wedlock and was abducted and then taken to the care of her real father. It should also be noted that authorities and Raymond searched the burnt-down remains of the house a few times after the incident and found absolutely no evidence that she died in the house. In 1959, 10 years after Ricky disappeared, Opal and Raymond separated and later got a divorce from one another. Opal and Elizabeth moved to Washington State. Forrest and Sharon both remained in the area with Raymond. Sharon recalled that her mother would frequently return to Wisconsin, and they would both go to Minnesota to visit relatives. Upon arriving in Minnesota, Opal would leave Sharon with relatives and then leave for days without telling anyone where she was going. Sharon and Elizabeth believed that Opal was secretly visiting Ricky whenever she took these trips. Opal's second cousin, Lois Kane, recalls that Opal had a relationship with a man whom she believes may have been Ricky's real father. Lois said Opal maintained a relationship with the man for years. The man has a daughter who would be the same age as Ricky would have been. The woman was contacted by both Sharon and Elizabeth. She agreed that her history is consistent with Ricky's and that she may have been their long-lost sister. The woman had her DNA tested against Ricky's DNA profile, but it didn't match. Investigators and her family continue to believe Ricky is alive and hope she's out there. It's believed she lives somewhere in the Midwest. Opal and Raymond Bryant have since passed away. Elizabeth is the only living family member of Ricky from the time she vanished. Forrest passed away in 2017, and Sharon passed away some time later. In Sharon's obituary, Ricky is listed as predeceasing her. Most investigators suspect Ricky died in the fire, but the exact circumstances of her disappearance are unknown, and her case remains unsolved.
Number 5.
Robert was last seen in Kennebunk, Maine in August of 1964. He was last seen at his residence on Hovey Street where he lived with his mother and stepfather. He has never been seen or heard from since his disappearance. Robert was not reported missing when he initially disappeared. According to investigators, Robert's parents moved out of the residence shortly after he went missing. In 1968, the floor of the basement of his home was cemented over. In 1976, investigators received leads that Robert's body was buried in the basement, so they dig it up, but found only some animal bones and a pair of eyeglasses. Robert is a white male and was 10 years old at the time, but would have turned 11 on the 21st. He was 4'3" and 70 pounds. He has black hair and brown eyes. Robert's case remains unsolved, but investigators are actively seeking his whereabouts. His mother and stepfather both moved to Kittery after his disappearance. Foul play is suspected. Please contact the Kennebunk Police Department, 207-985-6121, if you saw or heard something around the time Robert disappeared. More information is desperately needed to solve this case, and any information you can provide to authorities would be very helpful.